Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Imagine a quiet, sunny morning in Hawaii. The ocean sparkles under the sun. A gentle breeze flutters the flags on the naval base. Airplanes sit on the runways ready for routine training flights, and sailors and workers go about their usual tasks, unaware that their world is about to change forever. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by the roar of engines, and the first wave of Japanese planes appears over the base. By the end of the day, no one will ever forget those few hours. The strikes come swiftly and precisely. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers anchored at the harbor become easy targets for bombs and torpedoes. Aircraft on the airfield scramble to take off, but many are already destroyed. Chaos erupts on land and at sea. Explosions and fire engulf ships. Smoke clouds the sun, and sailors and pilots struggle to survive and fight back. Within minutes, the base turns into a battlefield where every second feels like an eternity, and every person senses that the world has changed forever. The reasons for the attack trace back to the tense events of the 1930s. Japan was expanding aggressively across Asia, invading China and preparing for a war to control resources, while the United States tried to contain its ambitions through economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure. Tensions escalated, and the morning of December 7th became the culmination of these efforts, when Japan decided on a bold and meticulously planned strike on one of the largest American naval bases. In the first moments of the attack, the battleship Arizona was hit directly and exploded, taking hundreds of sailors' lives. The battleships Oklahoma, California, and others were also heavily damaged or sunk, and hundreds of planes on the ground were destroyed. People panicked, sailors rushed to the decks to fight the fires, and crews on ships tried to launch lifeboats. While the first wave of attacking planes caused the most destruction, the second wave targeted airfields, fuel depots, and base infrastructure. Americans tried to organize a defense, but the surprise and coordination of the Japanese attack made it nearly unstoppable. The losses were massive: over 2,400 killed, nearly 1,200 wounded, multiple battleships destroyed, hundreds of planes lost, and the fleet temporarily rendered ineffective in the Pacific. Despite this, heroism appeared in every action. Some sailors tried to save the wounded, some rushed back onto burning ships, and pilots fought bravely against overwhelming odds. Each moment was tense, dramatic, and chaotic, yet it also revealed incredible courage and determination. This day would forever mark a turning point in history, transforming the United States from a neutral observer into a fully engaged participant in World War II, changing the course of the war in the Pacific and across the globe. As the smoke rose from the burning ships and the roar of explosions filled the air, American sailors and Marines struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction around them. The battleship USS Arizona lay in ruins, a massive plume of black smoke marking the site where hundreds had perished in an instant. Fires raged on the decks of other ships, and the water around the harbor was littered with debris, floating fuel, and the lifeless bodies of men who had no chance to escape. Amid the chaos, small acts of bravery emerged. Sailors who could barely comprehend the attack began organizing firefighting crews, attempting to prevent the flames from spreading further. Others leapt into the water to rescue their shipmates, risking burning fuel and collapsing structures. Fighter planes managed to take off from the few intact runways, engaging Japanese aircraft despite overwhelming odds. The pilots knew that every second counted, that the survival of their comrades and the fate of the Pacific Fleet depended on their courage and skill. On the ground, officers tried to establish communication with ships and airfields that were still operational, coordinating emergency responses while under constant bombardment. Telephone lines were down, radios were damaged, and the sense of order quickly deteriorated as the scale of the attack became clear. Families living on the nearby islands watched in horror from a distance, unable to help, their homes momentarily overshadowed by the smoke and fire from the harbor. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the Japanese
Each
pilots
moment was
executed
tense,
their plans with
dramatic, and
precision.
chaotic.
They
Yet
had
it also
trained
revealed
extensively for
incredible
months,
courage and
studying
determination.
maps, ship
This day would
layouts,
forever
and
mark a
daily
turning
routines
point
of
in
the
history,
American fleet.
transforming
The
the
first
United
wave had
States
struck
from a neutral
primary
observer
targets with
into a
devastating
fully engaged
efficiency,
participant
and
in
the
World
second
War
wave
II,
focused on
changing the
secondary
course of the
targets,
war in the Pacific
airfields,
and across the
fuel
globe.
depots, and
As
repair
the smoke
facilities.
rose from the burning
Every
ships
hit
and
was
the roar of
calculated to
explosions filled
maximize
the air,
destruction
American
and delay
sailors and
American
Marines struggled to
response.
comprehend the
But the
scale of
human
destruction
spirit
around
proved
them.
resilient
The
even in the face
battleship
of overwhelming
USS
odds.
Arizona lay in ruins, a massive plume of black smoke marking the site where hundreds had perished in an instant. Fires raged on the decks of other ships, and the water around the harbor was littered with debris, floating fuel, and the lifeless bodies of men who had no chance to escape. Amid the chaos, small acts of bravery emerged. Sailors who could barely comprehend the attack began organizing firefighting crews, attempting to prevent the flames from spreading further. Others leapt into the water to rescue their shipmates, risking burning fuel and collapsing structures. Fighter planes managed to take off from the few intact runways, engaging Japanese aircraft despite overwhelming odds. The pilots knew that every second counted, that the survival of their comrades and the fate of the Pacific Fleet depended on their courage and skill. On the ground, officers tried to establish communication with ships and airfields that were still operational, coordinating emergency responses while under constant bombardment. Telephone lines were down, radios were damaged, and the sense of order quickly deteriorated as the scale of the attack became clear. Families living on the nearby islands watched in horror from a distance, unable to help, their homes momentarily overshadowed by the smoke and fire from the harbor. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the Japanese pilots executed their plans with precision. They had trained extensively for months, studying maps, ship layouts, and daily routines of the American fleet. The first wave had struck primary targets with devastating efficiency, and the second wave focused on secondary targets, airfields, fuel depots, and repair facilities. Every hit was calculated to maximize destruction and delay American response. But the human spirit proved resilient even in the face of overwhelming odds. Medical personnel and sailors organized makeshift triage stations on shore, tending to the wounded while the attack continued. Firefighting crews battled the flames on burning ships, sometimes ignoring their own safety to save their comrades and valuable equipment. Despite the loss of life and property, the Americans fought back, shooting down Japanese planes, rescuing injured men, and attempting to regain control of the harbor. Reports of heroism began to spread quickly. Men who had survived direct hits on their ships helped others escape. Sailors who had jumped into burning water dragged their friends to safety, and pilots continued to fight even as their aircraft were damaged. News of the attack reached Washington, D.C. in the afternoon, and the shock sent a wave of panic and urgency through the government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was informed of the attack, and the initial disbelief turned quickly into resolve. Military leaders assessed the losses and began planning immediate responses to protect the remaining Pacific Fleet and prepare for retaliation. Meanwhile, intelligence officers analyzed intercepted Japanese communications, trying to predict the next moves of the enemy. Across the United States, citizens reacted with a mix of fear, anger, and determination. Families watched news reports, Radio broadcasts relayed eyewitness accounts, and the nation began to realize that nothing would ever be the same again. The attack had shattered the illusion of safety, and the full scale of the global conflict that was to follow was now undeniable. As the news of the attack spread across Hawaii, the full scope of the devastation began to sink in. Sailors who had survived the explosions and fires regrouped, assessing the damage to their ships and trying to salvage what they could. On the USS Nevada, for example, crew members fought tirelessly to maneuver the ship out of the harbor, despite it being heavily damaged and under fire. Their efforts prevented the vessel from blocking the channel, allowing other ships to leave and limiting further disaster. The United States Navy and Army began rapidly mobilizing, treating hundreds of wounded sailors and civilians alike in the Pacific, setting up makeshift hospitals. Naval bases were reinforced, often with very limited supplies, and including the aircraft carriers that had escaped the harbor, were immediately deployed to strategic positions engaged to deter further Japanese advances, attempting to intercept the remaining Japanese planes and protect the shore installations, and implemented new defensive measures to prevent another surprise attack. The surviving ships of the Pacific Fleet were repaired as quickly as possible, but the losses were severe, and the fleet was not yet at full operational strength. Despite this, the Americans demonstrated remarkable adaptability and determination, rapidly training new crews, restoring damaged vessels, and establishing new protocols for reconnaissance and early warning. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy, having achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor, continued to expand its reach across the Pacific. They occupied territories in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, aiming to secure critical resources such as oil, rubber, and other raw materials necessary for sustaining their war effort. The early weeks of the Pacific War were marked by a series of intense naval engagements, reconnaissance missions, and small-scale battles, all of which tested the strategic planning and resilience of the United States Navy. On the front lines, sailors and officers who had survived Pearl Harbor displayed extraordinary courage. Crew members aboard aircraft carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Lexington participated in rapid strike operations against Japanese forces, often facing overwhelming odds. Pilots engaged in long-range sorties, striking enemy installations and supply lines while returning to carriers under heavy anti-aircraft fire. The coordination between aircraft and ships became a critical factor in maintaining American presence and influence in the Pacific, as naval commanders realized that air power would be decisive in the coming battles. On land, military engineers and construction crews worked tirelessly to repair airfields and establish forward operating bases across the Hawaiian Islands and other key locations. Civilian volunteers assisted with logistics, medical care, and communication networks, ensuring that supplies, ammunition, and information could flow efficiently despite the initial chaos of the attack. Intelligence operations became a central focus as the United States sought to anticipate Japanese movements, decode communications, and identify weaknesses in the enemy's strategy. Cryptographers, analysts, and reconnaissance pilots collaborated to create a more accurate picture of Japanese intentions, a task made more urgent by the rapid expansion of Japanese forces. The first American counterattacks, though cautious, demonstrated both strategic foresight and individual heroism. Pilots launched surprise raids on Japanese-held islands, often flying hundreds of miles over open ocean with limited fuel and relying on precise navigation and timing. Naval commanders coordinated strikes that targeted supply convoys, disrupting Japanese logistics and creating opportunities for larger-scale operations. In these early engagements, stories of extraordinary bravery emerged. Sailors who manned damaged ships under fire, pilots who continued to fight despite critical mechanical failures, and intelligence officers who risked their lives to gather information essential for planning counterattacks. Each success, however small, was significant, as it boosted morale, demonstrated the resilience of the United States forces, and signaled to the enemy that the Americans would not remain passive. Meanwhile, the public in the United States absorbed the realities of the war through radio broadcasts, newspapers, and official reports. Families followed the progress of counterattacks, celebrated the heroism of servicemen and women, and contributed to the war effort through bond drives, industrial work, and volunteer programs. This widespread engagement created a sense of unity and purpose across the nation, reinforcing the resolve to respond decisively to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Strategically, military planners used the lessons from Pearl Harbor to refine fleet formations, improve air defense tactics, and enhance coordination between naval and air forces. Exercises and simulations were conducted to anticipate potential enemy strategies, and training programs for new recruits were intensified to ensure that the expanding Navy and Army were ready for sustained operations across the Pacific. By the end of the first few months, the United States had begun to regain momentum. Although the initial shock of Pearl Harbor had been devastating, the combination of rapid mobilization, technological innovation, strategic planning, and individual courage allowed the